The desert don't whisper often, but when it does, a man best listen. That spring afternoon, it wasn't the wind that called Silas Grady. It was a child's cry cutting through the sun-baked silence. They called that stretch of land the Devil's Nap, a scorched expanse of scrub and rock where rattlers sunned their bellies and vultures circled shadows long before bodies. Silas had not planned to cut through there, but Patience, his old sorrel mare, had veered instinctively toward the dry basin as thunderclouds hunched against the far mesas like crouching wolves. He'd tugged at the reins, thought better of arguing with her. She always knew the better path. Or perhaps she just knew when he didn't care anymore. It had been 9 years since he last heard the sound of a child crying. Back then, it was Mercy, his little girl, fighting scarlet fever, while Ruth sat at her bedside, Bible in hand, tears streaming down her cheeks in stubborn silence. That cry had faded slowly into death. This one cut like a whip crack, raw, panicked, too alive to ignore. He tugged Patience to a halt and listened, hand to his ear. There it came again. Not wind, not coyote, a child. Steady now, he murmured to the mare. Dismounting, he stepped down into the brittle underbrush, spurs clinking faintly against the dry rock. The sun bore down, cruel and absolute, casting heat mirages along the ridgeline. The trail narrowed between 2 stunted junipers, then dropped into a dry arroyo choked with tumbleweed. The sound was louder now, sharp sobs, the kind only terror can force out of lungs that small. He found her half hidden behind a cluster of cactus, curled up like a rabbit trying to disappear. Her dress, what was left of it, was torn at the hem and filthy. Her dark curls stuck to her face in sweat-streaked tangles. Tiny feet were raw and cracked, blood crusting around the toes. She was no more than 5 years old, but her eyes, wide, green as spring wheat, looked too old by half. When she saw him, she tried to push herself backward, thorns scratching at her legs. She gasped, but it was too dry for words. He crouched slowly, keeping his voice low and warm. Easy now, little one. I ain't here to hurt you. The girl's lips moved, barely a whisper. Don't let him take me back. Then she collapsed. Silas caught her before her head hit the stone. She weighed near nothing, just bones and fear, and sunburned skin. He cradled her in his arms, his breath caught somewhere between disbelief and something older, rustier, and deeper than words. He hadn't held something this fragile since Mercy. And God help him, he remembered exactly how it felt. Carrying her up the slope, he reached Patience and secured the girl gently across the saddle. She stirred briefly and murmured a name, Mama, then whimpered and went still. Silas climbed up behind her and adjusted her so she leaned into his chest. The heat was thick now, pressing down with the weight of forgotten tombstones. His hand settled lightly across her back. Hold on, little darling, he said, voice hoarse. We're gonna find you some help. Redwood Crossing sat 15 miles east, past the dry ridge and across the riverbed that hadn't seen proper rain since last autumn. He nudged Patience forward. The mare obeyed, slow and steady. As they rode, Silas found his thoughts tangled in the past. Mercy had died in 1869. Ruth followed that winter, coughing blood into her apron and pretending it was nothing until her hands turned cold and blue. He'd buried them in Kansas soil, walked away with nothing but a saddlebag and silence. Now this child, who was she? Who in God's name would leave a girl in that godless wasteland to die? She stirred again. They said I was cursed, she whispered. Face buried in his shirt. Silas stiffened. Who did, sweetheart? Papa. Said I brought devil's luck. Said the chickens stopped laying 'cause of me. He didn't answer. Didn't trust himself to. The words made something in his gut turn to stone. "What's your name?" he asked after a moment. "Clara," she breathed. "Clara May. But Mama called me Cricket sometimes." "Well, Cricket," he said softly. "Name's Silas. You're safe now. I swear it." The ride stretched long under the climbing sun. Around them, nothing but open land and wind that carried the ghosts of things unsaid. By the time they reached the edge of town, Clara was asleep against him, mouth open, breath shallow, but steady. Redwood Crossing hadn't changed much since he last passed through years before. One road, a clapboard church, 2 dogs too tired to bark. The general store leaned sideways like an old drunk against the sheriff's office. People stared as he rode in with the girl. He ignored them. Clara stirred, waking with a shudder. She looked up at the wooden sign swinging over the saloon and whimpered. "Don't let them find me," she whispered. "Please, Papa. Please." He wanted to correct her, wanted to tell her he wasn't her father, but the word clawed deep and stuck. They rode past the blacksmith and toward the doctor's building, a squat whitewashed office with a crooked roof and a chipped door frame. A tin sign read, "Thaddeus Rourke, Surgeon. Bleeding by request." The bell above the door rang as Silas carried Clara inside. Doc Rourke looked up from his ledger, squinting through silver-rimmed spectacles. He was bald as an egg and smelled faintly of iodine and smoke. "Sweet Moses," he muttered, standing. "Where'd you dig her up?" "South of the butte, curled up in a ravine." "Alive?" "Barely." Doc barked out orders and got to work. Water, clean cloth, bandages soaked in witch hazel. Clara barely flinched as he cleaned the cuts and dabbed ointment on the burns. "She's lucky," Doc muttered. "Another hour and you'd have been digging a grave." "I don't bury children anymore," Silas said, voice like gravel. Doc looked up sharply, then softened. Said nothing. When Clara was resting, cleaned and wrapped like a rag doll, Silas stepped outside to catch his breath. The town hadn't changed, but he had. A woman stepped off the boardwalk near the general store and approached him. She was heavy-set, with gray-streaked hair pinned under a bonnet, and hands that looked like they'd raised 6 children, and buried 2. "You the one brought that little girl in?" she asked. Silas nodded. "Name's Edna Lou Mercer. My husband runs the store. That child need clothes." He hesitated. "She lost near everything but her fear." "Well," she said firmly, "let's fix that." They walked together to the store. Inside, Edna Lou rummaged through a crate and held up a blue gingham dress, no frills, sturdy stitching. "She's small for her age," she noted. "You got somewhere to keep her?" Silas shook his head. "Well, we'll figure something," she said, wrapping the dress in brown paper. "Redwood Crossing might be small, but we ain't without sense." Clara woke near sundown, her face pale but eyes clear. Silas knelt beside her, holding out a tin cup of water. She drank slowly, then whispered, "You came back." He nodded. "Told you I would." She reached out and touched the sleeve of his coat, then curled back under the quilt. Outside, thunder cracked once, low and distant. The storm had passed, but something else was coming. As the sky darkened, Clara stirred and whispered again. "Silas? I'm here. Do I have to go back?" He looked down at her, saw the bruises blooming under the skin, the raw fear still hiding behind her eyes. "No," he said, "not while I'm breathing." He stayed with her through the night, dozing in the chair, his hat tipped forward. The oil lamp flickered beside him, shadows dancing on the walls. The town remained quiet, but in the east, a dust cloud stirred. Riders, 3 of them, closing in. "She don't belong to nobody," Silas muttered, "which means now she might belong to me." The wind had teeth that day, biting down as Silas crossed into Redwood Crossing, a town too stubborn to die and too old to dream. He hadn't returned to this place expecting kindness. Last time he passed through, it was just after Ruth's burial. And the town hadn't spared him more than a glance. Even then, it had the look of something half forgotten by progress. Now, with Clara May nestled in the crook of his arm, like something he wasn't sure how to hold, Silas saw it differently. A place not dead, but tired. Like him. He passed the shell of the old mercantile that had burned down 5 winters back. The story went that a widow cursed the owner before riding out of town, barefoot into the snow, and sure enough, lightning hit it the next evening. Locals still murmured about that. Curses, ghosts, retribution. The same kind of talk that now followed the girl in his arms. But talk couldn't match what he'd seen. He felt Clara stir against his chest, and her fingers gripped the lapel of his coat. "Don't let them find me," she murmured again. Her voice was quieter now, like a wind dying over cracked earth. Silas felt her words dig deep, the same way Ruth once clutched his hand during Mercy's fever. Whispering, "Keep her safe, Silas. Keep her safe." He had failed once. He would not again. He guided patients through the narrow alley between the old saloon and the churchyard fence, where the grass was brown and trampled. Folks watched from porches and behind half-closed shutters. They didn't speak, but they saw him. The door to Doc Rourke's office opened with a tired creak. The inside smelled of alcohol and something metallic. Doc stood with his arms crossed, spectacles sliding halfway down his nose. "Well," he muttered, "you didn't ride her out of town, so I suppose she's still breathing." "She's resting," Silas replied. "She needs more than that. She needs stability, shelter, and someone who can promise they won't run when it gets hard," the doctor grunted, motioning to the cot where Clara now lay curled under a blanket stitched with faded roses. "Can you offer her that, Grady?" "I aim to." The doctor studied him. "Lot of men aim to. Not many hit the mark." Silas didn't answer. He was too focused on the child. Her face had a little color now, and her breath came steady. Still, every movement made her flinch, as though she expected pain at every turn. "You'll need clothes," the doctor said, "and she'll need food. Proper food. Not jerky and trail biscuits. I know where to go." He left the clinic just as the sun tilted westward, and the light turned a shade of gold that only ever touched desert towns. Dust rose with every step toward Mercer's general store. He tied patients to the hitching post and walked inside. Edna Lou Mercer stood behind the counter, sleeves rolled up, arms dusted with flour. "Well now," she said, squinting at him. "Did she eat?" "Not much, but she's holding water." "She speak?" "Enough." "And?" "She's scared. Says her folks called her cursed." Edna's eyes darkened. That poor lamb. She pulled a small dress from a shelf behind the counter. Blue gingham, plain, clean. "You'll take this," she said, "and these too." She piled stockings, underthings, and a pair of small leather shoes onto the counter. "No charge. I've got coin. You'll need it for bread and beans. Don't insult me by arguing." Silas nodded. "Thank you." "She needs a place to sleep," Edna added. "The boarding house has a back room. I'll speak to Rose. She owes me." As Silas gathered the parcel, Edna rested a hand briefly on his arm. "You're doing right by her. Even if this town doesn't see it yet." Silas paused. "She asked if I'd send her back." "Did you say no?" "Of course I did." "Then you're already halfway there." He returned to the clinic as the shadows grew longer and the first fingers of twilight reached across the land. Doc was gone, but Clara was awake. She sat up slowly as Silas entered. "I got you some clothes," he said, offering the bundle. "Might be a bit big, but we'll make do." She took them silently and held the dress in her lap, stroking the fabric with trembling fingers. "It's blue," she said. "You like blue?" My mama did. She said Blue kept away bad spirits. Silas knelt beside her, meeting her gaze. You don't need anything to keep away spirits, Clara. You've got me now. Her lips quivered, but she didn't speak. Instead, she leaned forward and wrapped her arms around his neck, holding tight. They spent that night at the boarding house. Miss Rose, the keeper, didn't ask questions. Edna had already spoken. Silas stayed in the chair beside the bed, while Clara curled into herself beneath the quilt. Around midnight, the wind picked up, that dry, unsettled kind that signaled something not far behind. Silas didn't sleep. He just watched the oil lamp flicker against the wall and listened. The next morning broke clear. Blue sky stretched like glass, cloudless and unkind. Clara was still sleeping when he stepped outside. The porch creaked under his boots. Then he saw them. 3 riders approaching from the east, horses lathered with sweat. Dust rose behind them like a ghost's tail. They weren't moving slow. They weren't looking friendly. He didn't need to be told. He knew. By the time the horses pulled up, he was waiting in the street, arms crossed. Clara still slept inside. Patience was tied near the fence, her ears twitching. The lead rider was thin, sharp-eyed, with a jaw like a boot heel. The second was a woman in a crisp dress that didn't belong in the desert. The third was younger, barely a man, with eyes that darted everywhere but forward. "That our girl you've got holed up in there," the lead one called out. "She's under my care," Silas answered, voice low. "Well, she ain't yours. Name's Elias Rake. This here's my wife, Temperance. Boy's Roy. We've been looking for that girl." "She said you left her." Elias snorted. "Child's touched in the head, always making up stories." "She wandered off. She was 15 miles out. No shoes, near dead. That a regular occurrence in your house?" "Listen, mister. You think you're some kind of hero, but you're just meddlin'. She's ours. We got papers. I'd like to see them." Elias reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a crumpled parchment. "Judge out of San Tomas Junction signed it. Says she's Temperance's by previous marriage." Silas unfolded the paper slowly. Ink bled in places. The signature looked wrong. He didn't speak. Just handed it back. "I found her abandoned in the desert. That's the only truth I know." "She brings bad luck," Elias snapped. "Since she came, our crops died. Chickens dropped dead. My wife took sick. I'm tellin' you, she's cursed." "That child ain't cursed," Silas said. "But maybe you are." Temperance looked away. Roy shifted in his saddle. Elias glared. "You best hand her over," he hissed. "We won't ask again." Silas didn't flinch. "You already forfeited your rights the day you left her to die." Tension drew taut as wire. Then the door behind Silas creaked open. "Papa?" Clara's voice cut through the morning like a bell. She stood barefoot on the threshold, hair tousled, eyes wide. "They're here," she whispered. "Don't let them take me." Silas turned slowly and looked at her, then back to Elias. "You heard her," Elias spat. "You'll regret this." He yanked his reins and wheeled his horse around. Temperance followed. Face pale as ash. Roy lingered for half a heartbeat, then rode after. Silas stood in the dust until they disappeared into the horizon. Behind him, Clara slipped her small hand into his. "She ain't your blood," Silas says, stepping between them. "And she sure as hell ain't your property." Some men talk about justice like it's written in scripture, but in places like this, it's often written in ash and smoke. The dust hadn't settled in Silas Grady's chest. Even as the riders disappeared toward the hills, the air still tasted like an argument that hadn't ended, only paused. Clara May's hand gripped his fingers tight as they stood on the front step of the boarding house, her thin shoulders tense beneath the patched shawl Edna Lou had given her. The word Papa still hung between them, tender and uncertain, like a note played too softly to be heard by anyone but the heart. Inside, Miss Rose moved about the parlor with a nervous hush. Outside, the townsfolk who'd watched the confrontation from porches and behind curtains now went back to their business, murmuring low and cautious. A few eyes stayed longer than they should, not out of cruelty, but confusion. In towns like Redwood Crossing, lines were drawn quick, and loyalty came slow. Silas said nothing as he led Clara back inside. He could still feel Elias Rake's words echoing like a crack in a canyon. She's cursed. But when Clara looked up at him, her eyes were not filled with the fire and brimstone fear of a child possessed. They were the eyes of someone too used to being unwanted. That Silas knew too well. Edna Lou came by near sundown, a small loaf of cornbread wrapped in linen and a quiet expression behind her steel-gray gaze. She didn't ask what had happened. She simply touched Clara's cheek, looked Silas in the eye, and said, "You'll need to get ahead of this." He nodded. "Tomorrow. San Thomas Junction. You writing to the judge?" "I am. I figure if they've got papers, I need a lawman who knows the difference between ink and truth." Edna looked at the girl, then back again. "She'll need to speak for herself, won't she?" Silas's jaw tightened. "She will, if it don't break her." That night, he sat awake in the corner of the room while Clara lay curled in the bed. The oil lamp flickered low, and the wind outside shifted from dry to biting. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. Not a warning, just a sound of something trying to be heard. Just before dawn, they set out. Silas bundled Clara in an oversized coat and lifted her onto Patience. She didn't speak much on the ride, just leaned into him and hummed under her breath, some tune her mother must have sung. Her voice cracked, but she didn't stop. San Tomas Junction rose from the desert like an afterthought, its wooden storefronts brighter than Redwood Crossing, but no more refined. The courthouse stood square and stern, its paint peeling, and a single bell hung in the gable above the door. Silas tied Patience to the rail and lifted Clara down gently. They walked up the steps together. Inside, it was cool and quiet. The scent of old paper and dry ink hung in the air, like smoke that had settled years ago and never quite cleared. Judge Horace Bellamy sat behind the desk, spectacles on the tip of his nose, scribbling into a worn leather ledger. His hair was silver, combed back, and his coat was pressed as if it still mattered. He didn't look up when Silas entered. "State your purpose," he said. Silas cleared his throat. "Name's Grady, Silas Grady. This here is Clara May. We're here 'cause someone's claiming custody over her with papers I don't trust." Bellamy raised his head and studied the two of them. His gaze lingered on Clara. "That's so. She was found near dead south of the Butte. Says her folks left her there." "I see." Bellamy set down his pen and leaned back, folding his hands over his chest. "Come, sit." They took the chairs across from his desk. The judge opened a drawer and retrieved a second sheet of parchment, the very same Elias Rake had waved in Silas's face. "This is the document they submitted. States Temperance Rake was the girl's mother by prior marriage. That true?" "No," Clara said, her voice soft but firm. Bellamy's brow arched. "You understand what you're saying, child?" "Yes, sir. Mama's name was Margaret. She died when I was little." "That woman ain't her." Bellamy looked at Silas. "You mind stepping out a moment?" Silas hesitated. Clara looked scared, but she nodded. "It's okay, Papa." He left the room with a heavy heart and stood outside the door, listening to the wind whistle through a broken window pane down the hall. It sounded like Ruth's breath when it turned to frost in her lungs. He thought of Mercy, of how small she looked in that coffin, too small for death. Clara had the same kind of strength, fragile but rooted. When Bellamy called him back in, the judge's face had shifted, not softened, not hardened, but recalibrated. "She's told me plenty," he said. "Enough to raise questions. I'll launch an inquiry. In the meantime, she stays with you." Silas exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. Bellamy leaned forward. "I'll be needing witnesses, someone who can speak to her state when she was found, someone who's seen how she's lived since. Doc Rourke, Edna Mercer. Good. I'll summon them." "And if the papers are forged," Silas asked, "then Elias Rake is in more trouble than he bargained for." Outside, the sun was high and white. Silas lifted Clara back onto Patience. She leaned against him, calm now. "Did I do all right?" she asked. "You did fine, Clara. Braver than most men I know." She smiled, just a little. Enough. They rode back to Redwood Crossing in silence, broken only by the sound of the horses' hooves against hard-packed earth. 3 days later, the town buzzed with talk of the coming hearing. Doc Rourke stood in the back of the church after Sunday service and told anyone who'd listen that Clara was more lucid than a preacher in a thunderstorm. Edna baked a pie and said nothing, but her gaze could slice through stone. Clara waited each day with a patience that mirrored the mare she was named after. She sat on the boarding house porch, feet swinging, sketching pictures of birds in the dust with a stick. Then, on the 4th day, a man in a uniform handed Judge Bellamy a telegram. The judge read it slowly, then read it again. Silas stood across the street, watching. Bellamy folded the slip, walked into his chambers, and returned an hour later with his coat and hat in hand. He crossed the street and looked Silas in the eye. "A woman from St. Louis," he said, "claims to be Clara's grandmother." Silas said nothing. "Says she's been searching for 3 years. Investigators traced her granddaughter to Arizona. Wants to meet the child." Clara stepped out onto the porch just then, her eyes curious. Silas felt his throat close. "She have a name?" he asked. Bellamy nodded. "Martha Ellingridge." That night, Silas tucked Clara into bed as usual. She looked at him with worry, but didn't ask what the telegram meant. He watched her drift to sleep, her fingers curled around the edge of the quilt. The embroidered roses faded, but still whole. And outside, under a bruised sky, the sound of hooves approached the gate, slow, deliberate. A lone rider, silhouetted by lantern light, pulled a stagecoach to a stop. "She ain't your blood," Silas says, stepping between them, "and she sure as hell ain't your property. Some reckon the dead haunt the plains, but sometimes it's the living, showing up with eyes that look too much like those we've lost." The next morning dawned without a sound. No rooster crowed. No cart rattled past the boarding house. Just that odd hush that sometimes came before something heavy, a storm, a death, or the truth. Silas Grady stood by the window with his hands wrapped around a tin mug of coffee gone cold, watching the rider from the night before make her way up the main road, stagecoach wheels groaning beneath their weight. She was older than he expected, silver hair pulled into a neat bun beneath a traveling bonnet, a dress the color of smoke and pearl with the hem coated in dust. She sat erect, despite the wear of the road, posture proud, without being cold. The kind of woman who had once known drawing rooms and parlor lace, but wasn't afraid to walk through mud when she had to. When the coach stopped, she stepped down with the help of the driver, thanked him, and stood on the street like she had known it all her life, though her eyes moved like someone looking for something she wasn't sure was real. Clara May hadn't stirred yet. She'd had trouble sleeping. Silas had heard her breathing shift during the night, the whimper she tried to smother with the quilt, the way she whispered, "Papa, are you still there?" even when he sat just a few feet away. He'd answered each time, "I ain't going nowhere." But now, with this woman at the door, he wasn't so sure. A knock came, light, polite, but firm. Silas opened it with a deep breath stuck in his chest. "Mr. Grady?" she asked. "I am. My name is Martha Ellingridge. I believe you might be caring for someone I've been looking for a very long time." He nodded once, motioned her inside. "Clara's still sleepin'." "That's all right," she said gently. "Would you mind if I sat a moment?" He pulled out a chair and poured her some coffee from the kettle on the stove. She took it with hands that trembled just a bit, then pulled a small velvet pouch from her bag. From it, she withdrew a locket, old gold, worn thin at the edges. Inside were 2 miniatures, one of a young woman with chestnut curls and green eyes, and the other of a baby with the same wild eyes Silas had seen staring up at him from the desert floor not so long ago. "My daughter Margaret," Martha said, voice husky. "She married a man named Charles Fletcher against my wishes. Drinker, gambler. Had a charm that didn't last through hard winters. When she died of consumption, he took their little girl and vanished. No forwarding address. I've been trying to find her since." She looked down at the locket. 3 years. I've crossed 5 states, spoken to lawmen, investigators, even a Pinkerton or 2. Finally, someone tracked down a custody filing in this territory under a name I didn't recognize, Temperance Rake. The trail led here. Silas swallowed hard. "Charles sold her," he said, "to the Rakes, for money and a bottle." Martha closed her eyes, just for a breath. Then she nodded. "That sounds like him." They sat in silence for a time, the ticking of the old mantel clock the only sound. "I don't intend to take her from you, Mr. Grady," she said at last. "I read the ruling from Judge Bellamy. You've done what no one else could. You saved her. I'm not here to undo that. I just want her to know she came from love, that her mother didn't leave her, that someone's been looking for her all along." Before he could answer, they both turned at the sound of footsteps. Clara stood in the doorway to the kitchen, barefoot, hair tousled, still in her nightdress. She looked at Martha with a mixture of suspicion and wonder, the way a child watches the sky before it rains. Are you my grandma?" she asked. Martha stood slowly, the old bones not moving as fast as the heart. "I believe I am, sweetheart." Clara looked at Silas. He gave her the slightest nod. The girl stepped forward, closer to the woman, then stopped. "My mama's name was Margaret." Martha smiled through the tears building in her eyes. "Yes, she had a little laugh that could fix any bad day, and she loved you more than anything." Clara's eyes welled up. "She died when I was little." "I know," Martha whispered, "and I'm so sorry I wasn't there." Clara stepped closer. "You came all this way?" "I did. I didn't stop looking." Silas watched as Clara touched the edge of the locket, as if it might vanish. "I don't remember her much," she said. "That's all right," Martha said. "I'll help you remember, if you'll let me." The girl looked over her shoulder. "Can Papa come too?" Martha's face twisted with emotion, and she nodded. "Of course, sweetheart." Later that afternoon, they all sat on the porch. Edna Lou brought sweetbread and mint tea. Martha shared stories of Margaret as a child, how she used to climb trees in petticoats, bring home injured birds, sing when she was nervous. Clara drank it in like water after a drought. Silas said little. He just listened, heart both aching and eased by the flood of memory that wasn't his, but somehow belonged to him now through Clara. That night, after supper, Martha stood by the gate with her travel case in hand. "I'll stay at the inn," she said. "Let you have your evening." "You're welcome here," Silas said, "if Clara wants you close." She smiled. "Tomorrow, maybe." As she walked down the road, her figure swallowed by dusk, Silas felt Clara's hand slip into his. "Do you think Mama sees me now?" she asked. "Knows I'm safe?" He looked at the stars just coming out. "I think she sees everything, and I think she's real proud of the girl you are." Clara was quiet for a long time. Then, in a voice so small it trembled, she asked, "Do you think Mercy sees me too?" Silas blinked. "What made you ask that?" "You talk about her like she was mine too." He bent down and gathered her into his arms, lifting her up as he had that first day. Maybe that's because she is. She'd have wanted you here. She leaned her head against his shoulder and didn't say anything more. Later, he laid her down, pulled the quilt up over her shoulders, and watched her sleep in the quiet peace that only the truly loved know. The stars outside stretched across the sky like candlelight on water, and outside the window, hoofbeats echoed once more, not fast or fearful, but slow, steady, and sure. "I love you, Papa," she says. And in the still air of Grady Hollow, where the wind carries no more cries, Silas whispers, "I love you too, little darling, more than all the stars in this wide desert sky." Some stories end with a gunshot, others end with a handshake, but the ones that matter most, they end on a porch, under stars, with a child leaning against your side. Autumn settled over Grady Hollow with the quiet surety of a worn hymn. The air carried the scent of harvested wheat and aging timber, and the long light of each day spilled like honey across the porch rails. The ranch Silas Grady had built, piece by patient piece, stood against the horizon with nothing showy about it, just 2 hands worth of pride. A windmill that groaned when the wind got heavy, and a fence Clara May had painted with more enthusiasm than accuracy. It had been nearly 2 years since the courtroom in San Tomas Junction gave him legal custody, but the truth was, she had been his long before that. Ever since the desert, ever since her bloodied feet and broken voice had whispered, "Don't let them take me." Now she was 12, tall for her age, with a laugh that came easier and hands that were always smudged with ink or dirt. She was upstairs at that very moment, writing a letter to Martha Ellingridge, who had visited just 3 months earlier and promised to return for her birthday in October. That promise had arrived by mail the morning prior. In an envelope Clara read 3 times before placing it beneath her pillow. Silas stood by the corral fence with a bucket of oats in one hand, watching the horses shift lazily under the amber sky. One of them, a chestnut gelding named Jasper, had taken to following Clara around like a shadow. "He likes your voice," Silas had told her once. "You got a way of speaking that makes things grow quiet." That morning, she had told him she wanted to be a doctor. "A doctor," he'd repeated, smiling. "Like Doc Rourke," she said. "He says girls back east do it now, and I want to help children, ones who don't have papas yet." Silas had nodded, heart too full to speak for a minute. It had always surprised him, not that she had dreams, but that her dreams never bent toward revenge or hardness, even after what she'd endured. Instead, they leaned toward healing. A wind swept across the grass, sending the old chimes on the porch into a soft clatter. He turned toward the house as the door creaked open, and Clara stepped out, hands ink-stained, eyes bright. "Finished my letter," she announced. "Told Grandma Martha she better wear her Sunday best when she comes. I'm making biscuits. She'll bring city shoes and a ribbon for your hair, no doubt." "She always does." Clara smiled. "But I like my boots better." Silas chuckled. "Boots are more honest." They sat on the porch swing as the last light faded into dusk. The stars came out one by one, and the familiar hush of night began to settle over Grady Hollow. Clara leaned against him like she used to when she was smaller, before she grew tall and unafraid. But tonight, there was something softer about her, a quiet stillness. After a while, she asked, "Papa, do you ever think about the old days?" "All the time." "Do you regret finding me?" Silas turned slowly to look at her. Her eyes were clear and green, like the desert after rain. "Not once," he said. "Not ever." "I think Mama and your Mercy must have done something from heaven," she said, "to make us find each other like that." He swallowed. "I think so too." Silas remembered the way the desert had looked that day, the vulture shadows, the cracked earth, the silence. and then her cry, like the last note of a song someone forgot how to sing. "Sometimes I think," she continued, "if you'd gone a different way that day, maybe I'd still be out there. Or gone." He closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them again. "But I didn't. I found you. That's the only thing I care to remember." Their silence after that wasn't heavy. It was full, like a cup set carefully on a shelf. Somewhere in the field, an owl hooted. Later that week, Martha arrived on the afternoon stagecoach from Tucson, wrapped in a traveling shawl embroidered with gold thread. She carried gifts, of course, books, a stitched handkerchief, and a small tin box that contained a delicate silver pendant Clara's mother had worn as a girl. "She would have wanted you to have this," Martha said softly as she clasped it around Clara's neck. Clara touched it reverently, then hugged her grandmother tight. That evening, they ate on the porch under lantern light. Edna Lou sent over a pie. Doc Rourke stopped by and gave Clara a journal with leather binding and pages thick enough to hold ink and ambition both. "I hear you're fixin' to be a doctor," he said. "Best start writin' things down." "I'm going to be the best one in Arizona," Clara declared, and no one doubted it. The night stretched on. Martha told stories from St. Louis, Clara told stories from school, and Silas mostly listened, watching the way Clara's laughter no longer carried caution, how her eyes didn't dart to shadows. After the guests had gone and the dishes were cleaned, Clara and Silas walked through the fields. The grass whispered around their boots, and the moon hung low and pale. "Papa," she said, "I know I'm still young, but I want to make this place something." "You already have." "No, I mean, I want to build something here. A place for kids who don't have homes. A real place. Not just with beds and soup, but books and stories. Safety." He stopped walking and looked at her. "You mean it?" "Yes," she said. "I think that's why I'm still here. Maybe that's what the desert saved me for." His throat tightened. He couldn't speak, just pulled her into his arms. "You make this place more than what I ever hoped," he whispered. "I just want to give what I was given." The next day, Clara sat on the porch again, sketching a layout for her dream on a scrap of paper. She showed it to Silas. Rough pencil marks, little square rooms, a garden in the back. He nodded with pride. "Looks like it belongs," he said. Just as he set the drawing down, hoofbeats sounded beyond the ridge, sharp, steady, unexpected. Not the sound of neighbors or delivery riders. Silas stood, hand resting lightly near the old rifle leaned against the porch rail. Clara stood too, brows furrowing. From the dust trail rose a lone rider. The figure slowed as it approached the gate, then dismounted. In their hand, they held a letter. Silas narrowed his eyes. A seal he hadn't seen in years. The courthouse in San Tomas Junction. The messenger stepped forward and offered the envelope. Silas took it. He broke the seal and read, "This letter concerns inquiries made about a child formerly known as Clara May Fletcher. The desert don't forget. It just waits, under layers of wind, dust, and silence, for someone brave enough to remember." Silas Grady stood in the front room of the house he and Clara had built, the letter from San Tomas Junction held tight between calloused fingers. The paper had been creased 3 times and sealed with red wax from Judge Bellamy's office. Now broken, it lay open on the pine wood table, its words stark as winter sunlight. He read it again, even though he already knew every word by heart. The inquiry was brief but unsettling. A private investigator, hired by an unnamed party, had submitted a formal request for clarification regarding the origins and legal status of a child previously known as Clara May Fletcher, specifically citing matters of inheritance, bloodline, and disputed claims. Silas didn't need to read between the lines. Someone else, Someone outside of Redwood Crossing, outside even of Martha's circle, was stirring the past. And not for comfort, for something heavier. He stood silent for a while, staring out the window. The wind moved across the front field like a slow broom sweeping up secrets. Somewhere behind the barn, Clara was digging potatoes for the week's meals. Her humming drifted toward the house in fits and starts, careless, sweet, innocent. She hadn't seen the letter yet. By the time she came inside, hair wind-tossed and cheeks flushed, Silas had already folded the paper and slid it into the drawer under the ledger. "I got near a dozen," she said, setting the muddy harvest into the basin near the sink. "Might even be enough to share with Doc Rourke." He nodded absently. "You all right, Papa?" He turned to face her fully. "I'm all right." But the look in his eyes said otherwise. The next morning, they rode into town together. Clara perched easily in the saddle beside him, her heels brushing against the stirrups she was still growing into. The sky overhead was a quilt of gray and copper, the kind of clouds that hinted at frost but hadn't yet decided. At Edna Lou's general store, they traded potatoes for sugar and flour. Inside, Miss Edna peered at them from behind her spectacles and sniffed the air like she was reading more than weather. "Mail come through yesterday," she said casually. "Judge Bellamy's seal on one envelope. Came special courier." "I received it," Silas answered. His tone made it clear he wouldn't say more. Edna didn't press, but as he turned to leave, she called gently after him. "Some ghosts knock before they step in, Silas, but others, they come through the cracks." Outside, Clara asked, "Was that about me?" He looked at her. It might have been. They rode home in silence. Later that evening, after supper, Clara sat on the porch with her sketchbook, drawing ideas for her future sanctuary, the one she hoped to build for children without homes. Her lines were more confident now, the angles straighter. It looked like a place that could stand against wind and memory, both. Silas sat beside her, his gaze distant. Finally he said, "There's something I need to talk to you about." She looked up, serious. He reached into his coat and pulled out the letter. "It's about you, about your past." She took it slowly and read it, lips moving silently. When she was done, she folded it and looked at him. "What does it mean?" Silas leaned forward, elbows on knees. "It means someone out there's asking questions. Maybe someone related to your father. Maybe someone with a claim to land or money. I don't know yet, but I don't like how it feels." "Do I have to leave?" "No," he said immediately. "Never. You're mine, and no paper's gonna change that." Clara stared into the darkening sky. "Maybe I should know who they are." He didn't answer right away, just reached out and took her hand. "I'll find out," he said. But not alone. 3 days passed before the messenger returned. This time he bore a second letter, this one from a law office in Kansas City, confirming that a man named Victor Harrow had filed a claim contesting the custody ruling of Clara May Fletcher, alleging fraud and concealment of inheritance by parties unnamed. The letter had teeth, legal ones, and though it carried no immediate force, it reeked of menace. Silas rode to San Thomas Junction the next morning. He left Clara with Edna Lou, promising to be back before sundown. The trail to the courthouse was wind-blasted and cold, and his thoughts were no quieter. Judge Bellamy read the letter and set it down with a sigh. "I'd hoped this was done." "You know the name?" "I do. Victor Harrow was Charles Fletcher's cousin, opportunist, has land back east but gambled most of it away, always looking for someone else's scraps." "Can he undo the adoption?" "Unlikely, but he can make noise. Enough to stir doubt, maybe even enough to frighten the girl." Silas's eyes narrowed. "That's what I care about." Bellamy poured 2 fingers of whiskey into a small glass and slid it across the desk. "Then we'll need to get ahead of this." "What do you suggest?" A hearing. Voluntary. We summon Harrow, make him present his claims. If he fails, we shut the door permanent. And if he don't show, then we win by absence. Silas left with the hearing date inked into his journal. He rode hard back to Redwood Crossing. Clara was waiting, her eyes tracking the road from the porch rail like she'd been watching for hours. He told her everything. No softening, no secrets. She listened, and when he finished, she said, "Then we fight." Martha returned 2 days later, having received a copy of the letter herself. She was furious in that quiet way she had, the way her hands folded tight, and her words came through clenched lips. "Let him come," she said. "Let him stand before a judge and explain why a man who left a girl in the dust has more right than the one who carried her out." The evening before the hearing, Silas and Clara walked the land behind the house, the stars above thick as spilled flour. "I'm not scared," she told him. "I am," he replied honestly. They stood in silence for a moment before Clara reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded sheet. "What's that?" "My testimony," she said. "I want to speak." The next morning, they returned to San Tomas Junction. The courthouse was quieter this time. Not many witnesses, just the judge, a clerk, and the figure of Victor Harrow seated on the far bench, a man with slicked hair and a face like dried bark. He looked at Clara and gave a small, condescending smile. Bellamy began proceedings. "Mr. Harrow, state your claim." Victor stood and read from a paper, language twisted into something sharp and cold. He cited legacy, family name, obligation. He spoke of propriety. Not once did he mention Clara's well-being. Then Clara stood. She walked slowly to the center of the room and unfolded her paper. "My name is Clara May Grady," she said. "I was left in the desert to die. The man who found me saved me. He fed me, clothed me, stayed by my bed when I had nightmares. He's not my blood, but he's my father." Victor Harrow shifted in his chair. "I don't remember my real father," Clara continued. "But if he gave me away, he stopped being mine. I belong to the man who stayed." When she finished, silence filled the room like a cathedral after a hymn. Bellamy looked at Victor. "Do you wish to continue this claim?" Victor hesitated. Then, with a huff of disdain, he gathered his papers and rose. "No further action," he muttered, and left the courtroom without a backward glance. Outside, the wind had picked up. Clara stood beside Silas on the steps, her hand tucked into his. He looked down at her, and for the first time in a long while, his heart felt like it had outrun the past. In the distance, beyond the red earth and the sagging hills, clouds rolled heavy. Clara squeezed his hand. "I want to build it, Papa. My home for others." Silas nodded. "We'll build it together." And in the stillness that followed, the wind across the plain didn't sound like sorrow anymore. It sounded like the start of something new. This letter concerns inquiries made about a child formerly known as Clara May Fletcher. Sometimes, when the wind settles low across the canyon and the stars blink slow and steady in the velvet sky, a man can almost hear the echoes of what's come and gone, the rustle of a gingham dress through wildflowers, the weary creak of an old porch swing, the dry rasp of boot leather crossing wood floors long since gone to dust, and the laughter of a child who once thought the world had forgotten her, but learned it hadn't entirely. And in that quiet, you might remember a man like Silas Grady, who didn't set out to be anyone's hero, just a widower with a tired heart and a horse named Patience, a man shaped by loss and silence, who found not redemption, but reason beneath the blistering sun when he followed the cry of a child into the rocks and sand. And maybe you'll recall the girl, Clara May, with feet bloodied by the truth and eyes green like prairie after rain, a child left by the cruel, taken in by the broken, and grown into something strong and shining. like a silver coin uncovered in dry earth, the kind of girl who didn't let grief harden her, but let it shape her into something gentler, wiser, someone who spoke for those who couldn't yet speak. And maybe you'll remember the symbols left behind: a cracked leather saddle now resting near the stable door, a tin box full of Mercy's and Margaret's keepsakes, a journal with a girl's name written in looping letters. Her plans for an orphan house with painted shutters and beds made with quilts stitched by tired, hopeful hands, or the way the wind no longer howled like loneliness but murmured like memory, carrying with it the smell of wood smoke and fresh bread, and the music of distant piano keys drifting from the old church that now had life in it again, all because one man stood between a girl and her past and said, "No more." All because one girl stood up in a courthouse and said, "This is my father," even when the world told her blood was louder than love, and maybe, just maybe, if you sit still long enough, you'll hear Doc Rourke chuckling over a cup of coffee with too much sugar, or Edna Lou fussing over biscuits while pretending not to cry, or Martha Ellingridge humming a lullaby that no one's heard in years, the one her daughter used to sing. And maybe you'll feel the presence of those who never got to stay: Ruth with her soft smile, and Mercy with her laugh like summer bells, not as ghosts, but as shadows of light, as reminders that love doesn't vanish, it just changes its form. And as you sit with that, let it remind you that honor can be buried but not erased, that justice may come late but still matters when it lands, that sometimes the forgotten woman is the one who will raise the generation that remembers how to be kind, and that the truth doesn't need a crowd, only one soul stubborn enough to keep it lit like a lantern in the dark. And if you, dear listener, have ever believed in quiet courage, in the type of redemption that doesn't shout but steadies itself in silence, then maybe you'll leave a sign, a comment, a whisper of your own, to say you still believe, in second chances, in porch-light promises, in men who keep their word, and girls who grow strong, in the idea that sometimes it takes one stranger's kindness to rewrite the ending of someone else's story. And if this tale moved your heart in the smallest of ways, we invite you to stay with us, to subscribe to this quiet little channel, to sit beside our fire for the next story, because there are more like this, stories worn around the edges, stories lit by oil lamplight, stories that don't pretend the world is fair, but still believe it's worth saving. And maybe, as the dust settles and the world moves on, you'll carry this one with you, like a folded letter in your coat pocket, unopened, but known by heart.